Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest Lunch and Learn from AMPIA. My name is Jenny Steele. I'm a producer here in Calgary, and I'm so honored to be your host and moderator for today. Now, before we get started, we wish to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Indigenous peoples of this land, including the nations of Treaty 6, 7, and 8, and the Métis Nation of Alberta. We are grateful to work, live, and create upon this territory. As the original storytellers and keepers of this land, we have much to learn from the First Nations and Métis people. Now, today we gratefully welcome Jessalyn Dennis from 724 Films. In her role as VP Scripted, Jessalyn manages 724's extensive scripted development slate, as well as consulting on a number of shows in production. Recent development projects that have gone to production under her purview include the upcoming one-hour series for Global and Chorus called Family Law, the sci-fi Western and People's Choice Award-winning series Wynonna Earp, and the hit family series Heartland, the longest-running one-hour series in Canadian history, now in its 14th season for CBC and Up TV. She's also developed the one-hour period drama Fortunate Son for CBC. Thank you so much for joining us, Jessalyn, and we're so excited to have you today. Now, before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping details to just explain how the Lunch and Learn will work. At regular intervals, we'll go over the next hour. Jessalyn will answer questions as they come in to make sure that we don't run out of time at the end. And remember to write your questions in the comments bar to the right so that we don't miss any, and we will try to get to as many as we can. And we encourage everyone to be active in this group chat because that's how we know who is attending. We want to thank Alberta Film, the Edmonton Arts Council, and Telefilm for helping us put on this webinar and for supporting professional development in our province. Okay, now for the exciting part. If you're an AMPIA member, please email Bill Evans directly at bevans@ampia.org with your name or company name to be entered in the draw for a 500 Development Funds AMPIA Award. And you have to stick around until the end of the webinar because you need to be online to accept your prize. And then after the hour, we invite everyone to attend our virtual Christmas mixer on Zoom. The link is listed here in the chat where you can visit with old friends or make connections with new ones. We'll be hosting more events just like this with more awards in 2021. So if you're not already an AMPIA member, now is definitely the time to become one. And with that said, we are so happy to have you, Jessalyn. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Jenny. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm good. We're so happy to have you. Now I'm going to get right in there because we've got an hour and we've got lots to cover. So my very first question is, tell us about yourself. Now we know you've been involved in the film and TV industry for over a decade, but what do you do in film and TV? How did you get started in development and why did you choose development?
So I started off in film and TV kind of by accident. I guess that's a common story for a lot of people. I took a job as an assistant and I learned quite a lot about what the industry was like. And then I worked sort of on and off in TV as I traveled in my 20s and took different roles with different companies. And I was actually living in the UK when the job came up here at 724. And I had to decide whether to stay on over there or come back to Canada. And I sort of looked at the industry here in Calgary and realized that if I wanted to work in development, in a company in Calgary, there wasn't a huge number of opportunities that were going to come up, not like Toronto or Vancouver. And so I took a chance taking that job, and then I've been here now 14 years.
Good for you. And I remember reading your bio when I saw Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, that you worked on that. And I think I was mind blown because growing up, that was like the show for me.
Yeah, that was my very first role, working for the producer on that television series. And that probably dates me, but yeah, it was a really interesting one.
Oh, that's so amazing. Now, where do the ideas come from?
So in development, they can almost come from anywhere. For us, we develop in a number of ways. We generate our own original concepts and push them forward internally for a while before we attach a writer or a showrunner. We read a lot of underlying materials. So we look at books, we look at like graphic novels, and we can option those and then turn them into a property for television. We also work with a lot of writers. So writers will come to us with projects at different stages. They'll have a concept document or a pitch document. They might have a pilot script. So there's lots of entry points in terms of development, but we try and diversify our slate to the point where we're not concentrating all in one area. So we don't just do books. We don't just do originals. We sort of like to spread it out a bit. So we have something for everyone.
Awesome. And then do you ever acquire IP and creative?
Yeah, we do. We do option like I said, sort of books or comic books sometimes. And then if we're going to work with a writer, if they have existing material, if you're doing sort of a pitch document or a concept document, you know, that purchase price, that sort of option agreement, you can negotiate between yourselves. If it's an existing script, then that option amount is dictated by the WGC and the IPA. So there's sort of a baseline for what you have to pay for those. So you know, they can be more expensive, but depending on the project, it can be worth it as well.
Absolutely. Okay, are there any hallmarks of a good idea? And if there are, what are those, please?
No problem. I have your answer. So for us, a good idea, it's really hard to sort of say, you know, here are all the things it needs to have. I've looked across our slate and what we developed over the years, and if you look at something like Heartland, you know, it's a long-running family show that you can flip on with your kids in the room and you know what that's going to be. And if you look at Winona, it's a completely different beast, you know, like it's sci-fi, it's Western, there's swearing, it's, you know, there's some more adult content. And so the consistencies of those shows are really hard to sort of overlay and go, well, here's the common denominator. So for me, when I'm meeting with writers or potential collaborators, what I always say is a good idea is something that you're really passionate about and that your passion for an idea is contagious. So you know that you're the person to tell that story and you know why you want to tell it. And if you can get me excited about it and interested, then I can get a broadcaster excited about it and interested, and then they can translate that into an audience. So it's a really difficult thing to say, this is specifically it. But that is kind of what has worked for us across production over the years. Is if I look at all the shows we've developed and what has made it through to a green light and through to a 14th season, it's that the writer and creator was passionate at the beginning, and that passion and that belief in their project really translated across the board.
Yeah, that totally resonates with me, because I do think it's so obvious when someone's passionate or truly believes in what they're working on. You can just see it translate into their work.
Yeah, and for us, even especially in more recent years, it has become about not just the story that somebody wants to tell, but why they're the person to tell that story. And I think, you know, that can mean different things to different people, but that personal connection really gets everyone's attention.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm sure people are dying to know, what are broadcasters looking for these days?
So it's difficult to sort of speak across the board to all the broadcasters. I think in Canada, you know, there are definitely less broadcasters than there used to be. So with the concentration of different conglomerates, it's become pretty limited. And I think they have a difficult job, you know, like if you're looking at CBC, they're trying to satisfy a big audience across all of Canada. They have, you know, government investment, and, you know, they're trying to get that audience as well. If you look at Global and Bell, it's something potentially different. But I think what they look for changes. It changes quite quickly. And so I think those executives do the best job they can do of communicating that information as they sort of figure it out. But sometimes they'll say, oh, we want a 1 hour cop show. And then, you know, the world will happen. And then all of a sudden, maybe they don't want a cop show anymore. So my best advice in terms of looking at if you're looking for it to work with a specific entity, is if you want your show to be on Global, watch Global, see what they are making, see what they are commissioning in Canada, see what they're requiring, and take a look at that and go, okay, well, here's something that could work for them that's not exactly the same as what they already have, because of course they don't want something exactly the same, but they want it to be unique and different enough, but it has to work for their audience. So, you know, I think now more than ever, it's available to many of us to sort of consume all of that content and to pay attention to what's going on in those networks, and for us to be able to predict a little bit. I mean, it's never a sure thing, right? Sometimes they'll be asking for one thing and you'll go in with something that's completely outside of what they have done before, and they might do it, you know? So there's always that sort of like lucky chance.
Yeah.
But I think it is important to be informed about what, you know, if you're trying to sell something to someone, it's really important to know what they're already doing and to sort of watch what they're making so that, you know, you can have an intelligent, informed conversation about content.
Yeah, so the key is doing your due diligence and research.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. Okay, now let's say you have an idea. What are your next first steps?
So it depends on where your idea comes from. So if it's your original idea, that's one thing. And if it's, you know, a book that you read that you think makes a great idea for a show, then you have to do the work to option that idea. So I think if it's an original idea and you're a producer and maybe not a writer, then I think you want to partner up with somebody who can write your script. And you know, who can work on that material, because part of selling your show is not just about the idea, it's about the team. So you want to, you know, have somebody who can deliver that show if they want to make it. And then I think if you're, you know, looking to acquire the rights to an underlying property, then I think you need to also, again, do some research and figure out, you know, how that deal would work, what you would pay for that. And, you know, perhaps spend a little money to get, you know, some legal advice in terms of knowing that what you're doing is gonna be sufficient.
Okay, next one. Okay, when do you onboard a writer and showrunner, and how important is it to have that creative attached at this stage?
So it really depends on the project. You know, for us, if we're generating our own concepts, we like to take them to a certain point before we share them with a writer, because we want to do our best job of, you know, it's almost like a pre-pitch. Yeah. We're not pitching to the broadcaster, but we're pitching a writer to try and get them excited about our idea and to want to work on it. So in that instance, we really want to do our best. You don't want to go too far, you know, because we're not the writer. But I think we want to make it as compelling as possible for them to want to come on board and take that world and run with it. So with those internal concepts, we often bring them on when we have at least a 5-page concept document. And then we would share that with them and then pass it off at that point and let them drive the creative on it. You know, if it's a writer bringing a pitch to us or bringing a script to us, then obviously that person is still on board at that early stage. But often we get really cool ideas from writers who don't have a lot of production experience. And so the other part of our development slate that I haven't really talked about is that we do try to pair sometimes less experienced writers with experienced showrunners, because sometimes those, you know, new ideas are really compelling, and, you know, the broadcaster might really be interested in a world that somebody has created. And just because they haven't showrun doesn't mean their idea doesn't have value. It doesn't mean they're not a good writer. So part of it is about giving the comfort that should that idea go forward, that there is going to be somebody experienced, you know, like not like co-creating almost, but at least that they know that once we get to a production stage, there's somebody that they can trust to sort of handle, you know, the big decisions. And once you get to a production stage, what a showrunner has to do and be responsible for can be a lot. And so I think, you know, if a broadcaster is putting a lot of money into something, they want to know that between the producers and the showrunner, that budget is being spent properly and handled correctly. And so that's something that anybody can learn through experience. So we found that in pairing, you know, sometimes a much more experienced writer or showrunner with somebody who doesn't have that production experience, you can get a really interesting project. And then that creator, the original creator, is getting that experience so that they one day will become the sort of showrunner that everyone's coming to.
That's so nice. I love hearing that you're pairing like experienced with non-experienced. Have you ever had a time when you say you give your idea to a writer and they kind of take in a different direction that you weren't expecting? Sometimes. Yeah. I mean, often, especially if we've developed something original, we've developed it to a point that, you know, the writer kind of buys in or they don't. And, you know, we have to appreciate that not everything is for everyone. So often we'll go to a writer and say, we think this would be great for you. And it's not their thing. And so we develop those relationships that we appreciate that candor, because, you know, there's enough shifting and changing that has to happen sometimes in development when you pitch something to somebody and it's good for them, but then they want to change the direction, or you develop to a certain point and then they say, we're not going to greenlight this, and you might take it to a different broadcaster or a different person. And so,
I think it really is really important to be on the same page at the get-go, but it does happen sometimes when they see something different in it than you, and then you have to decide whether you want to proceed with their vision or maybe just say, it didn't really work out this time, but obviously we have a great relationship and we'd love to work on something different together. So sometimes it's okay to have those false starts, and just have it be an ongoing conversation.
Absolutely. Okay, now how important is it to have a director attached at this stage?
In development, it's not something we often do. It depends on the person, right? Because some writers are writer-directors, and so they bring that skill set to the table, and of course, that's a benefit. But at this stage, we don't, as a rule, attach a director this early on. It tends to be something that happens in later development, when you're getting close to a green light. And then people start talking about casting and directors and sort of stuff that needs to happen at that phase.
Okay, now what are the assets you develop and how long does that usually take?
Oh, I'm not laughing. So again, like it's so hard to give a rule because every project is different and every combination of things is different. So it's the idea, it's the writer, it's the property, it's the timing. Sometimes you can pitch something to a broadcaster and, they love it, but the time's not right for it because something similar has come out in the US, or they have another project in it with another entity that's too close. So I really think it's so difficult to sort of say, here's how it would always work. I think you have to be ready to pivot. But in terms of the time it takes to develop something, that can really vary as well. We've had some projects that, they get into funded development and then they're in production the next calendar year, which is extremely rare in Canada. The US model definitely moves faster. But alternately, we've had some other projects where we've developed it, we've gone through funded development, done 2 scripts and a Bible. Everyone's really excited about it. And for one reason or another, it doesn't get produced. And sometimes we have to tuck that away. And then, things will change again. And a year or 2 later, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years later, we might go back to it and say, this is a project we really believed in. And maybe it was just the timing. And we've had a lot of success doing that and getting it back into development or even to production at that stage. So, I think you have to know when to let things go sometimes, I think, but also, Tom, who I work with, likes to say good ideas never die. So sometimes we put them away and we go back to them later.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to hop over here to some attendee questions. We've got one here. It says, new ideas as opposed to optioning a book or play have such a hard time finding an audience without a big name star. Is it even worth it to develop new ideas when you are an emerging producer?
Well, yeah, I think so. I think it depends on what you're trying to do. I think new ideas, yes, I think lots of things have a hard time finding an audience without a big name star. And I think, even more so in comedy than drama, I think people are packaging. They're attaching a big name to a project before it even gets greenlit, I think that's a huge part of the success for something like Schitt's Creek, right? Like if they didn't have Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara at the outset, would anyone, Canadians would find it, and obviously it has a huge fan base and has been extremely successful. But in terms of the audience latching onto it at the outset, it's hard to tell, right? So I think that's definitely a factor in anything these days because there's so much content out there that how do you get your idea to stand out? It's a really challenging thing. But I think there's always room for something different, and as much as you find it challenging to sort of go, well, I could never get a big name star onto my idea, unique ideas sometimes make their way to people in unexpected ways. So I think a lot of development is about failure. Like if I think about the number of projects we've had to develop, unfunded, just even to get development funding in with a broadcaster from the CMF, like we develop 10 projects to get 1 in funded development. And then we'd have at least 5 in funded development to get anything greenlit. So, it can be discouraging, but quite a lot of what I do never sees the light of day. So I think if you believe strongly in your idea, then I think, what do you have to lose?
Yes, absolutely, right? Okay, we've got a question here from Eva Colmers. She's saying, how fully developed should a pitch package be before one can approach you? We have Bible, Pilot, Sizzle, etc. for our Lupita series. How can one actually reach and contact you in 724? So I think at this point, I will just mention that right now, Jessalyn is not accepting any pitches. So this is just an informative session, but we do really thank you for your question, Eva. But at this time, she's not accepting anyone to contact her. Okay.
Yeah, and it's a tough thing, right? Because there's lots of great ideas out there.
Yeah.
But, for us, from a legal standpoint, we do have to be cautious about unsolicited materials. So you can look on our website. There's a bit more of an explanation there as well.
Absolutely. Okay, another question here from Levin Creative. It says, we have to put some of our own money in to get started. So what's a reasonable expectation? Meaning, let's see what, I don't know if he had anything more on that. I don't think there's a lot of background there. Okay, I'm gonna go to, okay, how much is typically budgeted for development to try to get development funding? Oh, that was probably the first question. Okay.
That's okay. It just varies from project to project. I mean, I think, we do a lot of internal development here. We do a lot of concept creation on our own, but that comes at a cost, right? Like we have jobs at this company. And, if you're going to option something from a writer, that's going to cost money. And if you're going to option a book, that's going to cost money. But sometimes, you can find, if you develop a relationship with somebody or you want to collaborate, there are instances where we've had a collaborator, a partner who says, we have this property, we really want to make it for TV, but we're not a television producer. And they are maybe willing to option us something for, $1 for a limited amount of time. And, what we're investing is our expertise in terms of developing it. So, depending how creative you can be and the relationships you can build, sometimes you can make it a win-win for both sides. So it is really hard to sort of specify a budget. It's, kind of $1 to, $100,000, depending on the project. So, yeah, but I would encourage people to be creative problem solvers. Like, I think depending what you're bringing to the table, it doesn't always have to be about money.
Yes. Absolutely. Okay, we've got Randy asking, you mentioned the different phases of development. Can you give us an example of those phases?
Sure. So for us, we kind of break it into pre-development, which I kind of define as unfunded. So that's when you're doing something like putting your own money up front for a project or a property, and you're not getting any third-party money. And then funded development would be once you have a broadcast partner on board, and that broadcaster then allows you to access the CMF money. So then you can take that money and you can probably develop a couple of scripts and a Bible and, kind of prove up your idea. And then often that, if you're successful, will go into a sort of subsequent phase of development where you might do more scripts. You might then attach perhaps a director at an early stage there, or do some initial location scouting, do a production budget so that they can get an idea. It's not prep. It's almost like, it's like the end of development and like pre-prep. So then that often falls under sort of the development banner. And then once you get your official green light, and then it kind of moves into prep, moving towards production. And then it kind of changes over to like production financing and all of that sort of stuff.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Jessalyn. Okay, Philip's asking, what are the types of funding you seek and the order in which you seek to secure those sources? What is typically your first money in?
So if we're pitching a Canadian broadcaster, often that's our first stop, is if we can pitch them and get them on board, then we can get the development funding. They share sort of between like CBC and CMF, for instance. And because we're a regional company, there is an incentive where CBC can put in 25% of the budget and CMF will put in 75% of that budget. And so that's a benefit to us in terms of it being a regional company. Often, if we're looking to a more international market, there are other financing sources we can use. There's a couple of different initiatives through the CMF where you can get some pre-development funding. So it's enough to give you a little bit to, you know, underwrite your option, for instance, maybe pay for a pitch document. And all that is great for us in Canada because, you know, those sources aren't available to everybody. And so the government, you know, in Alberta and federally really supports us in terms of different initiatives. So it also depends on your project. Like if it's a feature film, then there's different other initiatives you can look at.
Yeah.
But
I think there's a difference between feature versus series. That's
yeah. So like Telefilm does sort of feature film funding, and then the CMF or the Canada Media Fund deals with television. So
amazing. Okay, shout out to our attendees for all these amazing questions, by the way. This is so awesome. Thank you, guys. Okay, our next one comes from Paige. She's asking, how common is it to use a writer's room during development?
So again, it just depends on the phase of development. But that often comes at a stage when you're getting closer to green light. So it probably wouldn't be the first phase of development. It would probably be the phase where you've already written a script or two with a broadcaster, and they're looking to build out into like episode 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then you would assemble your writer's room at that stage. And then definitely in between seasons, that's like, you know, so we do sort of see season 1 of a show, and then that gets produced and filmed and everyone's really excited. And then the question is, well, are we going to get a next season? So then we kind of drop back into development again. And then definitely at that phase, we would put together a writer's room to sort of, you know, get all the ideas coming forward for the episodes for the subsequent season. And then we would push that forward. And then, you know, fingers crossed, you get a green light for that season.
Awesome. Okay, now we've got another one saying, what should emerging producers understand about creating a winning application to the Alberta Project and Script Development Fund?
That's a good question. I wish I knew the answer to that, to be quite honest. Maybe that's something that that Bill can weigh in on at the mixer.
Okay, I'll ask Bill at the very end, actually, when he comes in. I'll have that one come up again. All right. Next one from Philip again. Do you develop scripts 100% internally, or do you go out for coverage or script editors?
So if we get to a stage where we are developing an idea or a concept into a script, then we definitely hire a writer to do that. And often, you know, writers or showrunners will work with a script editor just because sometimes that collaboration and that back and forth really helps. We don't tend to really go out for coverage.
Okay. Next one is coming in. It says, could you touch on the most important legal considerations for projects in pre-development?
Yep. Well, it does really depend, right? Because, you know, you talk about what is a good idea, where do you get ideas from, and you can't really copyright an idea. So I would say in pre-development, what you want to do is make sure that you have a very finite item for the source of your chain of title. Because when we get to production, we have to get insurance, and they want to know that legally we have the right to make this project. And so that goes all the way back to what is the first idea. So whether that's a concept document that you've created, whether it's a book that you've optioned and has a corresponding option agreement, that would be sort of the source of your chain of title. So I think you would want to make sure that before you put a lot of work and money into an idea, especially if you're a producer, like optioning it from a writer or creator, you want to make sure that you have sort of locked up your right to make that project when it becomes, you know, a pilot or a series. Okay.
I'm going to ask the next one up here. Do you develop a complete, okay, so I'm going to go back.
It's okay.
So just because we took a bunch of your questions here. Okay. Complete one or more final scripts in development.
Yeah, sometimes, I mean, more often than not, it's a pilot and then sort of like a Bible or at least a series arc to sort of say, here's all the things that are going to happen in the first season, and here's where the first season is going to end. So, you know, in previous years, it was always 2 scripts. I think as funding has gotten more difficult and we're doing less shows and that sort of thing, budgets have shrunk a bit. And so I think now it's always a pilot, but sometimes a second episode. And then just definitely a sort of corresponding document to talk about the season.
Okay. And do you develop a complete budget and financial plan at this time?
No, not usually. We usually have an idea, but sometimes the factors can shift, right? So if we sort of approach something and say, oh, we're going to film it in Alberta, and then we decide to go film it in BC, everything changes. So I think, the time to do that budget and financing is definitely sort of at the end of the second phase of development, when you're sort of looking towards proving up that you have an idea of what you're going to need for production.
Okay. And then when do you secure stars for the project, and how important is that for sales?
It's extremely important, to stand out in the marketplace. And I think the time to do that is definitely in that sort of pre-prep, late development phase, when you're trying to, not that you're competing with other projects at a broadcaster, but sometimes you are. And I think, you can secure somebody that everyone recognizes on a poster, that name can really help your project sell internationally, which is a big factor. So I think it is really important to keep that in mind as you go. And then also keep in mind that, perhaps at the end of the day, it's not going to be the person that you initially thought or the first 5 names on your list, but sometimes, these things work out in the best ways anyway.
Absolutely. Okay, Derek is asking you, if you have a script that you like, would you do a proof of concept for a 2 to 3 minute video, or would it be better to pitch it to a production company?
For us, we haven't had a lot of success with proof of concept videos or sizzle reels. I think that's something that's probably more common in the sort of unscripted world. For scripted, I think we want to see the script like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we've never had really any success selling our own projects using a video. So I think, if you have the script, you have the written material, and you have the writer or showrunner, that's kind of, I think, what most people are looking for.
Okay. Now, when do you first approach a broadcaster, and do you approach distribution at the same time?
So with a broadcaster, it again depends. But sometimes we'll go in with a pitch document and a writer. Sometimes we'll go in with a pilot. It does depend on getting to know your broadcasters and getting to know what the executives prefer. Some of them really like to be hands-on with a project, and seeing a fully developed pilot would potentially make them feel like they weren't really part of the process. And so other broadcasters love to see a pilot because it gives them a real sense of what the show is. So there are personal preferences along the way. But generally, when we feel like we've brought the idea together with the sort of right creative team, then we would go in and pitch it to a broadcaster. So it would sometimes be a short document that we follow up on our verbal pitch with, and sometimes it would be, hey, this is a really cool pilot, take a read. And then distribution definitely doesn't happen much in early development. I think that's something you're looking to put together when you're trying to get your production financing together.
Okay. Can I go back a little bit, back to where you said sometimes you go with a full pilot or you have the broadcaster collaborate? Has there been more success one way or the other, have you found?
No, I think it really varies and depends on the project. It can also depend on, who you're partnering with in terms of your writer or showrunner, because often, there are certain people that a broadcaster is really wanting to work with. And so sometimes that, tips the scale as well.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, now do you produce a sizzle reel or proof of concept trailer? And if so, what are the key elements that you include in it?
Yeah, we don't really, we have, dabbled in that in the past, and it's sort of a strange thing, I think, for scripted, because you're doing all this work on a script to show that you can essentially make a video. So if you make a video at the beginning, something about it just doesn't seem to land on the scripted side for us anyway. But we definitely had more success just pitching off the written material.
Yeah. Okay, now what happens when a broadcaster declines? Do you ever refine and then come back? And is that ever successful?
So sometimes, yeah. I think generally you have to listen to what the broadcaster says. So if it's a no, then it's a no. But if you're having more of a conversation about, often we've had pitches that they'll say no because. And that can be really helpful feedback for producers to understand why it's not a fit for them at that time, or what about the concept doesn't work for their audience. And so, if you pitch something and they say, well, no, because, we really don't want to have a kid protagonist. Our audience wants to see adult protagonists. then maybe there is something about that concept that you can turn it around and really make it work that way. And I think then if it's a no because, then you can go back in sometimes. But I think you have to be cautious as well in terms of understanding what your premise is. And sometimes when you try and twist and turn it all these ways to make it fit for what the broadcaster wants, you kind of lose sight of what is the core of the show. Mm-hmm. So I think you as the creator have to have a strong sense of what the show is, and definitely you can make changes, you can switch it around, but if you pull it too much, then sometimes it undermines what the show is.
Absolutely. And is it ever beneficial to take that idea like elsewhere? Like, would you suggest just fixing it right away, or can you take it elsewhere?
I think sometimes you can take it elsewhere. I mean, it depends, obviously on the premise, but you could definitely knock on more than one door. And, sometimes it's not a fit for that network. It doesn't mean it won't be a home run for somebody else.
Exactly. Okay. Philip's asking, I have a US-based producer attached to my feature who has access to US-based talent and sales agents. Do you see any advantage in shooting in the US versus Canada?
I mean, I don't do a lot of feature work. I think there's benefits to both. It really depends on your project and whether it counts as Canadian content, what money you might have access to, which I would look at. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's not my specific area of expertise.
Awesome. Okay, Michael's asking, do you have specific criteria for specific development cycles? Are you looking out to build out a certain genre, or are you genre agnostic? Does the market dictate what you are looking for, or is it a great story from the right voices first?
So in terms of development cycles, we kind of develop all year long. The funding cycles do shift a little bit, like CMF opens in April, it closes in December. So, we kind of are aware of what is possible through that funding model. But, we develop all year long, and especially, in March when our production shut down, we certainly concentrated on, doing as much development as we could, in that interim time. In terms of genre, we tend to more 1 hours, but in terms of we do YA, we do genre, we do straight ahead primetime drama. So in that way, I think we're open to pretty much anything, and we do develop a number of half hours as well, comedies and different properties. So I think we're pretty open, but we're very scripted focused.
Perfect.
And definitely a great story is, always the first ingredient. I think the market does dictate sometimes what people are looking for. If you look ahead to 2021, I don't think people are going to want a lot of apocalyptic, dark dramas about the world ending. I think that people are going to be ready for maybe some lighter content, maybe something more fantastical that they can kind of escape from whatever's going on in their daily lives. So I think in that way, the pendulum swings back and forth between darker and lighter content. But that being said, as soon as it gets to one side and everything is too light, then you'll have somebody going, well, we're really looking for something dark to balance out our slate. So I think a great story is a good place to start.
Yeah, that's so interesting to touch on, because even I'm noticing with series that are airing right now, some are addressing the pandemic and incorporating them into the shows, while some are trying to, I think, keep their shows as an escape for the audience. And it's mixed on how people feel about them.
I agree. I mean, I think it's even mixed in terms of the audience. If you said, well, how did you feel like The Good Doctor treated the pandemic? And some people might say, oh, I thought it was great. It was really compelling. Other people might say, oh, well, I had to turn it off. It was too close to home.
Yeah.
So, I think, there's something for everybody.
Absolutely. Okay, so looking at smaller productions, what are the best practices or advice you have for new producers who aren't quite ready to jump into the scale of 724 productions? How do you move from micro budget pitches to larger productions?
It's a really tough question, because it is kind of a jump. But I think my advice would be, if you're starting out, to work with others in your community. I mean, I think the film community in Alberta and in Calgary has lots of talent and lots of great people, and 724 definitely works with a lot of different entities, and we collaborate with not just writers and creators, but we collaborate with other production companies. Our new show Family Law, coming out on Global, we're working with Lark Productions on that. And so that has strengthened that show for us. And, you know, it's a win-win for everybody. So I think if you're starting out, you know, help somebody else on their project, work together, read each other's stuff. I think, you know, that's the way to grow the industry, and that's the way to make those connections, because 10 years from now, you never know who's going to be the next big thing. And if you've built that community and you've built those collaborations, you know, then I think it benefits way more people than feeling like you're in competition.
That's so that one resonates with me so much, because I feel like since I've started in this industry, collaboration is the key. And I just feel like, you know, making connections and supporting one another in this industry is how you get to where you want to go.
Yeah. And I think, you know, sometimes it goes back to like, if you want a friend, be a friend, you know, yeah. If you can get really stuck on your own issue and your own challenge. And sometimes the way to shake that loose is to help somebody else.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, now if you've never worked in scripted television before, how would you develop an idea?
Again, this is a really tough one. You know, I think it depends where the idea is from. You know, I think there's lots of examples online of different pitch documents of successful shows. They often publish the scripts now. So you can take a look and see what other people are doing. You know, my best advice, if you want to step into scripted television, is to watch TV and see what you like and see what you don't like, and see why, and see what different broadcasters are making, see what different producers are making, you know, follow writers and showrunners that you think are interesting. I think doing your research, becoming informed, that's extremely valuable.
Absolutely. Okay, another question here. What percentage of your project funding is broadcaster, distributor funded, government grants, and private equity based?
So in Canada, our model is not really private. So it's, you know, the broadcasters have their money, and then they sort of trigger the government money through CMF. So that tends to be the way that we put our budget together, and then we sort of add the distributor. You know, there's different tax credits and things in production that we can also access, but our model is very much using those entities as opposed to, you know, the studio model or having like a millionaire friend. So it's just it's different, and co-productions can sometimes be different too. You know, there's lots of different ways to develop and to look at, you know, working with a writer or a company in a different country, to sort of, especially through CMF, there's lots of different co-production models and like treaty models that can help you access money on both sides. Okay.
And he's got a follow-up asking, how do you structure BC, Alberta provincial co-productions to take advantage of the higher tax credit in BC? He says it required the BC producer to hold creative control.
This is one that I can't really speak to. By the time we get to sort of a production budget, it's not usually my purview. It's our business affairs team and our executive producers. So,
okay, awesome. All right, okay, Jessalyn, too. I'd love to hear. Is there like a fun? Because it's so amazing to hear these stories of all of your development now. Any fun stories you can share from when you were just starting out, or, you know, going back to our collaboration process where maybe someone helped you in the industry or vice versa, that you can share like a personal story for us?
You're throwing me for a loop.
I know.
I mean, I think there probably are, but nothing really comes to mind at the moment.
That's fine.
I mean, I think, you know, a lot of what I learned definitely happened from starting as an assistant, you know? Mm-hmm. And so if you want to learn about the film industry, I think, you know, being an assistant, you know, putting in your dues, working as a PA, like it's not always fun, but I think you can get a real sense of what the industry is like, because a lot of film is very hierarchical. And I think you can tell people who have sort of worked their way as opposed to, you know, showing up and saying, I'm going to direct. I think it's important to sort of, you know, remember that everybody has a role, and, you know, to have that respect for everyone around you.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to ask our attendees to throw in their last questions here before we wrap up. And I also want to remind folks to put their names in, because the cutoff is approaching here. So make sure you get those names in for the draw that's happening at the end of our discussion. So Jessalyn, while we're waiting for the last few questions, is there anything you want to touch on that we didn't talk about yet?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there was anything that we didn't get to.
I'm looking at our list here, and I think we got.
I know we were worried about
I know.
the amount of stuff.
Did we get to the assets? What are the assets you develop? I think we did, didn't we? Yeah, we did. I think we covered all the questions I've got here, and I think we covered all of our viewer questions. So, there's one here from Derek. Jessalyn, I was wondering if you ever had a mentor to help you along with your career. Oh, I love that one.
That's a good question. I mean, I think I've had various mentors. I think, obviously working with Tom and Jordy for 14 years, they've had quite a lot of success and they have a long track record. I think I've learned from the way they handle themselves in the business and in the world. I think I've worked for, various showrunners that have really, set an example for me in terms of, especially women in television. I think you always remember those people that kind of want to build you up instead of sort of push you down. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we've got one here from Geraldine. Does one have to have an agent to be considered as a director for one of 724's TV series? And what is the best route?
I think generally we do take director submissions from agents.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Laura's asking, you mentioned a concept document at the onset. What is usually detailed there?
Okay, so a concept document would generally have a log line, like a 1-sentence description of your show. It would describe your main characters. It would talk about, the big things that happen in your first season. Often it contains like a tone or style section that, you might draw in various comparisons of other existing shows to sort of say, here's kind of what we're going for. And just kind of the big beats of what would happen in your show. And, and in more recent times, we have also included generally a section about why do you want to tell the story? Why now? Why you? And that seems to really distill the idea sometimes. Again,
going back to believing in the project and the passion behind it.
Yeah, and I think, development is a long slog. Like you have to do a lot of work and sometimes it doesn't go anywhere. And sometimes there's so many great projects that we've worked on that haven't ever seen the light of day. So, I think if you're starting out in development, my best advice would be to not get discouraged. If your one idea or your first idea if it's not a home run, if it doesn't get to production, don't let it discourage you, because sometimes you have to put in a lot of that work on different projects to have one get through.
Keep on trucking.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay, Glenn's asking, say that we think we have a great idea for potential development and we would like to test it with a developer like you. Are we better to write it as a book first, or is going direct to a screenplay or a treatment a better way to get an acid test of its viability as a film or series?
Well, I think it depends. If you're up for writing a book, then I think, you're ambitious. So I think that's great. But I think if it's an idea for television, then yeah, I think, write it as a concept or a premise or a treatment and definitely, see what happens.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think writing a book is the most, expeditious route to production, but, people do it sometimes and they'll say, oh, this idea didn't work for me as a TV series. I'm going to write it as a comic book, and then it will get optioned for a series. So, never say never.
Right. Keep the options open.
Exactly.
All right. Paige is asking, is a pitch document more about outlining your initial idea or presenting a season arc?
I think it can be both. Often you don't necessarily want to outline the whole season at that stage. So I think it is, more focused on the initial idea for sure. But often I think you want to include, if there's something mid-season that turns your show, then you want to point out that happens. Or, if the season ends in a cliffhanger, then maybe if you have that already envisioned, you want to include it. Okay.
Now, do you know if Canadian broadcasters support features as they do series?
I don't. I think there have been some initiatives in the past. I don't know what's currently available.
Okay. Oh, here's a nice light one. Brent is asking, what are you currently watching yourself that you find fresh and engaging?
Well, Brent, I just finished season whatever of The Crown. So yeah, it is, my advice is always, if you want to make television, watch television. And I have to watch a lot of stuff for work, so I know what's out there. So often I watch 1 or 2 episodes of something and not the whole series. But I did make it all the way through The Crown. And I most recently watched The Queen's Gambit. So
yes, me too. So good.
so it's not always all Netflix, but sometimes it is. I'm just trying to keep my house from watching Hallmark movies because it's just too much.
I know.
There's too many. We can't start. We'll never stop.
I know. My kids are young.
Not to knock Hallmark movies because they're very successful, and I know a lot of people that work on them. But I think it's like too much of a good thing sometimes.
Always the happy ending.
Yeah.
All right. Now, how much effort do you put into making your pitch documents reflect the tone and style of the show?
Oh, that's a good one. So I think in previous years, we used to focus a lot on the content. And I think that's, still important today. But more recently, we have been putting a lot more work into sometimes a more visual representation to illustrate tone. I think it's a difficult thing because you can put too much work into the visual side. And if the reader doesn't respond to your visual choices, then it can be a turnoff. So it's about finding that balance to make sure it's still focused on the content of the document, but often including a couple of key images to illustrate tone and style can be really helpful. And I think it's becoming more and more common for people to pitch that way. So I think it's definitely something to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it can be difficult. Like, we often go back and forth over it. If you have a main character, do you want to put a picture of a famous movie star next to that character's name when you know that famous movie star is not going to be in your show?
Right.
Does that help illustrate who that character could be, or does it hurt? There's definitely a balance there. So I think it's just something you have to feel out for yourself. But yeah, I would definitely pay some attention to the imagery.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What do you find are the key differences between working with a Canadian or US broadcaster during the development process from a creative and business perspective?
It really depends on who your broadcasters are. I mean, I think we've been quite fortunate that our broadcast executives have been extremely collaborative and supportive of our projects. So those can be quite rewarding relationships, and really, working on a project together can be really fun and really interesting. I think, it just really depends on your relationships. We've had a lot of good luck with working with really intelligent and creative people who, we're all pushing in the same direction. I know there are some stories of having, a show with a Canadian and an American broadcaster at the table, and sometimes that push and pull can be really difficult to manage. We haven't had too many of those horror stories ourselves.
Now, do you differentiate between pitch deck, lookbook, and business plan?
Oh gosh. I mean, to me, those are, the business plan is maybe slightly different, but I think a pitch deck and a lookbook, I don't know what the difference would be between those. I think, the sort of deck is something that's used interchangeably. Often that has like a more visual take. But yeah, I think, to me, there's not a huge difference between those two.
Okay. Well, Jessalyn, I think that's our show today.
Great.
I can't thank you enough. I know everyone is probably feeling like me. I had so many Oprah aha moments with this. It was just so lovely to hear your point of view, and you were so gracious to give us this time. So we can't thank you enough for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's only my perspective. It's not everyone's, but I wish everyone good luck with all their projects.
Thank you so much. Now, before I get Bill to come on, I'm just going to reiterate Laura's note here. It just said, we're having more webinars in the new year with great incentives. If you aren't an AMPIA member yet, now, once again, is the time to join and be included in the draws. And you can see the link here over in the chat. Okay, now for the moment you have all been waiting for. So I'd like to ask Bill Evans to come on screen so we can find out who the lucky winner is for today's draw. Hi, Bill.
Hi there.
How are you?
Good, thanks. Got my Grey Cup hat on.
Whoop,
So,
whoop.
with all the names in here.
Drum roll. We're waiting.
Edmund Rotea.
Oh, Edmund. Congratulations. You are one lucky person today. $500 towards funding. There you are.
Yay.
Awesome. Okay, thank you all so much for joining us. Now a reminder, the Christmas mixer will be beginning in about 5 minutes. So head on over to the Zoom link, which you'll see in the chat right away. We can't thank you all enough so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and have a safe and happy holiday season. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.